Thank you. And hello, everybody. Actually, because of the topic and the previous presentations, now I feel like a little bit like I'm defending my master degree about museum definition and responsibilities. And after a presentation, probably I will not hear that received or not this Lithuanian part. So why it's mission impossible? Because the first law of museums was set and adopted by the parliament in 1995, and new version was only in 2003. And since then, we have only some changes in some paragraphs of the law of museums, but this document was never revised in full scope. And for several governments, it was, and it seems, mission impossible, because everybody were expecting a huge work and huge discussions, and that it's very complicated to renew this legislation document. And now I would like to show that it's possible to do it, despite all the 9 circles of Dante Inferno. We passed all of them through, and because the change of the law of the museums was set in the government program of this period, and we started in 2020 with the establishment of a working group, because we didn't want that the law of the museums should come from up to down to the sector of the museums, and we gathered together museum professionals from national, state, municipality museums, non-governmental and experts, just to revise the at this moment law in act and to propose the new project. At the beginning of the year, the group started work, and it ended in May. And we just focused on the aim that we have to review the legal regulations of the museum activities. Also, it's time to define the museum's mission and activity principles, and focusing on improvement of the quality of the service provided for the societies by the museums, and specifying the functions because of the globalization, of the new trends in museology. Some new issues came, and we had to take in consideration them. And therefore, these work started, and as a procedures, it's obligatory to have a consultation with the Council of Museums, and we presented to the Board of Association of Lithuanian Museums the project made by the working group. Some changes appear. For example, you will see later when we have a definition of a museum, we put on the table the definition, the project definition by the ICOM, but it led that when we showed this definition to our lawyers, we said put the literature in other parts of the legal act, because the definition should be very clear and understandable, and it is a regulation document, it's not, concept of a museum. So we tried our best to separate the definition of a museum of ICOM in different parts of the law of the museums. Also, as well, we have a public consultations, one from via email. It means that everybody could send the proposals, remarks, suggestions to us, what to put into the law of museums. We considered them, we revised them. Some of them were very interesting, but not for the law of museum. Taking in consideration, and as well we have one roundtable discussions when we have people from culture protection, from culture heritage sector, from NGOs, and many fields, not only the museums gathered together just to discuss about the project of the new law of museum. And after these public discussions and all these consultations, we gave the project of the law of museum to the government. It's also some circles of procedure came through, because when other ministers joined the discussions, and we have to make a compromise and adapt to the other legislation, in the state in Lithuania, that it should not be contradicted in the law of the museum with other legislation acts. And finally, on 23rd of March, the Parliament of Lithuania Republic adopted the law of museum, a completely new version, and it is entered to force on the 1st of April. We always say that, you know, this is the day of fools, but okay. This is the law of museum entered into the force in Lithuania. It's serious. And but the work for the Ministry of Culture didn't end, because we had to have many prepare a new one and to change many implementation documents following the law of museums. It means we have to change 5 orders of a minister, then to adapt and 2 new documents which is related to the law of museums, and as well as to change 16 statutes of the national and state museums because of changing of the functions, and even sometimes a description of the one of the museums, and I will explain it later, because it's an issue of translation. For the first time, we decided, it is a preamble of the law of the museum, and after that, lawyers said that we should think about how to put all these, you know, descriptions and like we call literature somewhere else, not in the very precise paragraphs of the law of the museum. We decided that the Parliament should take into account the mission of the museum, and afterwards we adopt the law of the museum. So this is a translation without addition of English-speaking editor. So basically the mission of which is taken in consideration by the Parliament of the Republic of Lithuania is to shape human historical, cultural and social experience actively and suggestively by using traditional and modern means of communication, presenting to the public the tangible and intangible evidences of humanity and its environment, preserved and researched in museums in compliance with the principles of openness, cooperation, social responsibility, and sustainable development. Afterwards, we are affirming that the preservation, research, and dissemination of these tangible and intangible cultural heritage are great importance for all groups of society, recognize that the museum participate in the process of formal and informal education, which is very also important, that it's for the first time stated in the law of the museum, drawing attention to the fact that the activities of museums must be aimed to ensure the preservation, research and dissemination of tangible and intangible cultural, historical and natural heritage, and emphasizing the importance of creating conditions for accessibility of the museums. Finally, as I mentioned, on 23rd of March, Parliament of Republic of Lithuania adopt the law. The most important was how do we have to define the museum. And after the discussions with the museum sector and after the discussions with also the other stakeholders like Ministry of Justice, and also we have a commission of the Lithuanian language, which is a procedure quite complicated to come through. After all the document preparation, we decided that in Lithuania, museum is a legal entity or division of a legal entity whose main activity is to collect, protect, preserve, restore, research and popularize the values of tangible and intangible cultural, historical, natural and technical heritage with the aim to provide public with opportunities for knowledge, education, studies, dissemination of creativity and quality leisure. So in Lithuania now museums are, previously it was said that it should be budgetary institution or legal entity of another legal form, and now we decided that it doesn't matter what kind of form, it's budgetary, private, joint stock company, association, it should be a legal entity or could be the division of a legal entity. For example, in Lithuania it's very basic example. For example, Lithuanian railways, we have their own museum, railway museum, so it's also a museum. We consider it like a museum, but we have to fulfill the main functions that it's set in definition. Also, we more precisely define what is a museum value. We usually use the definition of exhibit, but it was decided that the exhibit is very narrow definition, that the museum value is more broader, and the necessity that we call museum value, it should be in the account of the museum collections. And museum value can be exhibit if it is exhibited to the public or shown in the permanent or temporary exhibitions, but it have to be included in the accounting of the museum collections and have their own accounting number. It can be tangible, intangible, despite the form, but it should be in the account of the museum collections. New definitions came in the museum, the law of museum. We haven't had them in previous law. It's permanent exhibition. What do we consider as a permanent exhibition? It's also the meaning of translation. In Lithuanian language, it's quite easy to distinguish them. It's like a permanent exhibition, expozicija, temporary is paroda. But to be more precise and clear, we just decided, the working group decided to include it into the law of museums. The new definitions of museum education, museum communication, preservation, and as well as a new definition of chief curator of museum collections, because previously we didn't have this definition, and it is previously we have a chief fund keeper. And in order to enlarge the functions, the functions of this position, we decided to use the word and definition of curator. And it means that chief curator of museum collections are not only responsible for preservation, accounting, and of the museum collections, but also it is included that this position participates in the museum education and museum communication activities according its competences. As well, the operating principles of museum or main principles of activities were set. We have 5 of them. It's responsibility, openness and non-discrimination, competence, creativity and transparency, and publicity. They are here just described in more detailed. It's a responsibility that museums must ensure the preservation of national identity and historical memory, culture, history, natural and technical heritage. Competence that museums must strive for the highest quality performance results, properly perform their functions, and museum employees must constantly improve their competences. Openness and non-discrimination is everything that all the society all the visitors should feel welcome welcome and important in the museums, and museums must be open for changes, expectations, and needs of a society, innovative methods and of work. Creativity, museums must apply various museum and public communication tools in their activity and develop civic identity, adapt to the changing operational conditions. And one of also of these principles is transparency and publicity. It's stated in the law of museums that museums in carrying out their activities must be based on the principles of honesty and transparency and give priority to public interests. Employees must avoid the conflict of public and private interests, do not seek personal gain, do not abuse their position, do not tolerate bribery, protection, nepotism, fraud, and observe total intolerance to corruption. And museums must use their funds and other assets allocated to them in transparent, rational, and efficient manner. During all the consultations with ministries and stakeholders, it was necessary to define what public services museums provide to the society. So after long discussions and complicated discussions, we decided that museums, national, state and municipality museums, provide two public services, which is available to everyone, is museum visits and museum educations. Do not ask me about the necessity of this in the law of museums, but it was obvious that it should appear in this document, as the Ministry of Internal Affairs are changing the public service legislation, so we just step in this, period when we paid a very precise attention to the new documents. So we decided that the museum visits and museum education is a public services provided by the national, state and municipality museums, which means that the state or municipality ensures and provides funding for the museums to give the services to the society. In the new law of museums, we declined the museum classification and types of the museums because it was obvious that sometimes when it's very difficult to define what kind and type of museum you should assign a particular museum, because the collections are very diverse and historically formed. And for example, to the new law of museums, we had, when we are changing the statutes of museums, we usually wrote the culture history museum, because it was impossible to write only historical, only technical, only artistic. So it was decided that it's not necessary to have the classification of the museums, and that the diverse of the collections is a value. So there are no such a thing in the law of museum. We have changed the notification procedure. We do not do any accreditation of museums, but previously it was obligation just to inform when the museum, not state and national, but for example municipality or other museums, private ones, if it is closed or reorganized. So within 10 days you had to inform the Ministry of Culture. But we have a statistical system in the ministry, and we are responsible for a museum policy of the whole Lithuania. So if we know everything about how many national, state, municipality museums are in Lithuania, we feel the lack of information about private ones. And therefore it was said that also about the establishment of the museum, the Ministry of Culture should be informed that for example, I and my colleague would not and nowadays still the new law of museum, we found about the new museums of hammers, of some cars, through media, not officially. There is no necessity to have any permission to establish, but you have just to inform if you establish a museum. We have changed the appointment of the chief museum collection curators. Previously, national and state museums, which are under the Ministry of Culture or under the other ministries, they were appointed by the ministers. It means by the ministry. But at the same time, we were the deputy directors in the museum. So we have this double subordination in the national and state museums. Previously, maybe it was like some kind of way to avoid, as we say, I don't know, not selling, but losing the collections. Then the chief fund keeper was appointed by the minister. So the director, if he's in conflict with or some disagreements appear, he can't just do anything. And the chief fund curators had to inform the minister if something wrong with the collections happening. But the times changes, circumstances changes, and this is double subordination was a threat and a very big difficulty in the national and state museums in the collection management. So it is set in the law of museums that this position is a deputy director position, obligatory position in national, state and municipality museums. They are appointed by the head of a museum. Museum Council, it's not a museums council, but Museum Council, it worked in national and state museums. but not in municipality ones. So in the law of museums, it is said that it is started to be obligatory in national, state, and municipality museums. We defined the functions of this museum council, but it's only recommendation for the museums. It means for public, non-governmental, private, any other museums. If they want, they can have such a structure in the museum. And it is also said that the head of a museum can't be the head of a museum council, and 1/3 of the experts should be from outside the museum. Qualification requirements, we also once again said that the Minister of Culture defines and confirms and sets the qualification requirements for national, state, and municipality museum directors and for the chief curators of the museum collections. And this is, for the first time, it's maybe complicated, but also these tables are related with the main changes in the law of the museums. We have 4 national museums and we have 16 state museums. As I mentioned previously, we also changed the title of a state museum. In English, we always translated like a state museums, but these yellow ones in Lithuania were called Republican museums. So it's very confusing, and we decided that we will change and it will be the state museums in Lithuanian, it's valstybinis. So it's the direct translation, and we don't have any Republican museums or democratic museums and etc. So 12 museums are under our ministry, Ministry of Culture, 4 under other ministries. The system is the same and left the same. Now we have municipality museums, and previously we have such a thing like departmental museums, which is a part of some entity, for example, railways, chocolate factory, or etc. So, and other museums. So we decided that all these departmentals and other museums are others, and we just included in the system of the Lithuanian museum competence centers. We have no, now at this moment, separate legal entities like museum competence centers, but in the future, to avoid like changing of the law of a museum each time when it is necessary, if it is necessity to have a competence center like restoration competence center, separate entity, it is possible, just we are already set in the system and will make the whole system. The main change in the financing of Lithuanian museums, previously all the museums were eligible to apply for the funds to the Lithuanian Council of Culture. Since 2024, we take away all the national museums and state museums under Ministry of Culture from the Lithuanian Council of Culture to the Ministry of Culture, and we will be financed by the Museum's Activity Promotion Action Plan. The title is very complicated. We call it National Museum Program. It's easier. So since 2024, national museums and our state museums will not be eligible to apply to Lithuanian Council of Culture. Only the other state museums, for municipality museums and other museums, will be eligible to apply. And the last one is that main change is about the appointment of the heads of the museums. So we have obligation of a competition. Contract is 5 years, and for the national museums nothing has changed. 5 years contract, and the same person no more than 2 terms at the same museum. State museums 5 years term, but unlimited number of terms of contracts. So after each 5 years we have competition, and we can apply, provide the programs. And we made only one exception for the municipality museums because of the requests of the municipalities, because we claim that there are no professionals in their regions. So the exception is made that the mayor can not, it's not obligation, but he or she can appoint the head of a museum for the second 5 years term if it is during each year going evaluation of its work is evaluated as good and very good. And nowadays we are just collecting the information from the municipalities, how many mayors used this exception of the law of the museums, as well as we see from the media that in municipality museums new directors are coming, so we will see how it works in practice. So very short, I just finished my presentation. Maybe you have any questions that I have not mentioned, or you have just wonder what has happened in Lithuania.
Thank you, Vaiva. Probably we will listen to Mario's presentation, and then we will please remember your questions, and then we will make a round of questions on legal issues of museums in our countries. Is it fine with you? Oh, thank you.